Thank you so much for coming. You're all very brave. I'm sure you don't quite know what to expect. And I hope I won't disappoint you and be boring and normal, so there'll probably be some interesting things, viewpoints that might be confronting or different or exciting, some things to explore, and that's what we're here for. So, okay. Music from a biblical worldview. Here we go. This is from actually one of George Frederick Handel's scores. And see the letters S, D, G, and then down you see G, F, H. Right? So SDG stands for Soli Deo Gloria, which means all glory be to God. So this actually represents a worldview of many of the composers of that time, that music should be composed for the glory of God. And that's also my humble prayer. So I want to talk about how my biblical worldview informs my creative process. Unusual these days to hear something like that, isn't it? But I'm going to start with a piece just to relax. I'm going to take you all on a little journey through my imaginary trip into the country. It's called Fields of Freedom, and this piece is all about the freshness that I feel when I spend time wandering around or walking around in God's creation. There you go. That's out near Braidwood, I think. What is the origin of creativity? Big question. What is the origin of music, and why do we create? Why do we enjoy music? So, in order for me to discuss the origin, I'm going to contrast two very different narratives that are both around in the world of ideas today. So one of them is the biblical worldview, the biblical narrative, and the other one is what I call the atheist materialist viewpoint. And the atheist materialist viewpoint is that everything is completely accidental. The universe came into being by chance, no purpose, no intelligent planning. All of our creativity, intelligence, aesthetic appreciation, even our morality, our sense of right and wrong, is a result of random mutations and natural selection. So the Bible view is that we are made in the image of God as creative, intelligent beings, children of a creative, intelligent creator, a creator who loves beauty, and endowed us also with a love of beauty and an ability to create and communicate. Two radically different, contrasting worldviews. So, and I think we can say that they're pretty much mutually exclusive. Things are either designed or they're not. If you find something and you look at it and say, this is designed or this is accidental. Right? Now, if designed, there must be a designer with a plan and a purpose. Right? If it's accidental, there's no designer, no purpose. There's no real middle ground there. I mean, a designer can design a machine that makes things, such as a car production line, something like that. A designer could do that, right? But it's still designed. Right? So, now, I'm going to use the word evolution tonight. It's a rather hot topic. But I want to explain what I mean by evolution so everybody understands. Evolution means change over time, right? Now, creation believers don't necessarily deny that some adaptation and change happens within species, within different animals. For example, you might take the example of an Arctic wolf and a wolf that lives in the forests. And they're very similar animals, but one is adapted to live in an Arctic environment, one is adapted to live in a forest. One has brown fur, the forest one, the Arctic one has white fur, right? Now, the contemporary creationist scientists, none of them would say, oh, species never evolve, nothing ever changes, everything stays. It's called the fixity of species, right? So I'm just explaining this so when I say the word evolution, people know what I mean by it. So the contemporary creation science would say that both the wolves are descended from a common ancestor. Right? But what the materialist, atheist view of evolution is that everything came from nothing. Everything came from one organism. A long time ago in a primordial soup, a little bug somehow coagulated itself, and from that every single organism has been produced. Right? This is the accidental materialist view of evolution. Right? So the creation scientists would counter that such a scenario cannot account for things like our eyes, large-scale structure like wings on birds. These are things that many parts need to work together to make that unit work. Right? It's not something that can just happen by accident. Many different discrete parts have to be together, working for that thing to be actually beneficial, to be retained as a beneficial mutation, if you will. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. That's called irreducible complexity. And I wanted today to talk about some of the hardware and software, hardware, that enable us to be musicians. Where does it all come from? But first of all, I want to tell you a bit about my own story and why this is important to me and how I arrived at the position I hold today. I actually grew up in a Christian home, very loving mum and dad, and they were founder members of this church. We used to go to church when it was in the Torrens Primary School, and finally mum and dad, I think they're founder members of the church that meets in this building. And if you look out on the bench I don't know if you happen to see my mum and dad's name is written on there. It's a dedication to them. So I was confirmed in this church when I was 12 years old. But even while I was being confirmed, I remember thinking distinctly to myself, I'm really just doing this to please mum and dad. I don't believe in this. Right? I was basically in my heart at that time an atheist, even when I was 12 or 13 years old. And looking back, I think really the reason why is because I'd seen some very authoritative sounding BBC programs with maybe Carl Sagan or someone like that talking and saying that we weren't designed, it's all an accident, we evolved. And I remember the Time Life book of Origins Science, which had the picture of all the apes and gradually, getting taller and taller. And there's lots of parodies of it today. So eventually the guy stands up straight, then he gets bent over and he's working on a computer. Probably seen that one. So there are all these images and things that I'd seen. And basically, to me at that stage, I thought, well, we don't really need this God and Bible business because we all evolved, right? So by age of 16, I was a confirmed nihilist, atheist. And I no longer went to church. One night when I was about 16, I wrote my little personal atheist manifesto on my desk. I probably should have been doing homework, but I decided to wax philosophical. And I said something like this: there is no God, the universe is a result of pure random chance, there's no reason or purpose to it. There's ultimately no reason for us to exist, and we will eventually pass into nothingness. Sounds a bit like what Dawkins and Sam Harris and Hitchens and some of those people were writing a few decades later, and they sold books by the millions, so maybe I missed my calling. Could have been rich. But God had other plans. Dad must have found the paper, my dad, because the next evening at dinner he said, "Son, I read what you wrote about there being no good, and I think you're going to find out that one day you're going to need something." And Dad must have known that, because our house was burned down in the 1962 bushfires in Victoria, our house in Warrandyte, and a few months later, about a year later, my brother Nick was hit by a car at the bottom of our road, and he nearly died, but he survived, thank God, and he's still alive. But it must have tested his faith to the limit. And my mum also one day said to me, during the time of the bushfire and Nick's accident, I know I had divine help. And she paused and repeated, I know. But I was a lot cleverer than my parents. So I did my high school, finished high school at Canberra Grammar, and I took a gap year to study piano. And then I got accepted to study composition at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music, which I was really excited about. It was an exciting but disorienting time, living all alone in Sydney in a grungy little apartment in Glebe, really living the life of a bohemian. But I also lived out my nihilistic faith to the limit. And I had my daily devotions with Franz Kafka, Albert Camus, and Hermann Hesse, etc., and was thoroughly depressed most of the time. But then I started to believe in something, and it was all Bach's fault. Sometime towards the beginning of 1980, there was a performance of the St. John Passion at the Conservatorium of Music, and the conductor was Richard Gill, who you may know, and he's just passed away recently, and he's been on the radio today. So at that time, I really loved Bach, and every time I had such a thirst for playing Bach. Whenever I was depressed, I would just spend time playing Bach, and I always felt this peace. And during this concert, I was completely transported by the music. But more than that, I think the words, the story of Jesus' passion from the Gospel of John, it was the St. John Passion, really moved me. And I remember walking out of the concert hall saying under my breath, I believe. But around the time of that concert, my closest friend from high school also became a Christian and started writing letters to me. And I was still struggling with my beliefs, and I thought, oh no, another one gone. Another brilliant mind lost to the cause of intelligence and reason. But eventually I went to make the trip to visit him in Adelaide, and within 24 hours I received Jesus as my Saviour. I stayed with Hugh for a while, and a few weeks in, that was the days of group houses, so I thought I'd hang out there for a bit. A few days later, he asked me if I believed in the theory of evolution. And not having ever heard an alternative, I said, yeah, sure, just happened. Time, life, Carl Sagan, BBC, must be true. So he had a little twinkle in his eye, and he said he had something he wanted to read me. So together we read a scientific refutation of evolutionary theory that affirmed that the biblical creation story was accurate, and also pointed out a lot of the scientific weaknesses for the case of evolution. It was actually quite simple compared to the very advanced and professional and well-researched literature that's available today about the design and the creation argument. But the arguments were still clear and convincing, and it hit home. And I think that moment was an extremely important moment in my life. And for the first time, I actually believed that I was a created being. I was not an accident. It was like an orphan suddenly being reunited with his parents. The joy was unspeakable. And I decided at that moment that this was the God who created me and loved me and saved me, and that I wanted to serve him with my life. So that's a little bit of my story. Now I'm going to just play a little bit of Beethoven. Something a bit joyful. So now I'll actually start talking about what I think is the origin of creativity. Oh, by the way, the scientists have done tests about the human brain activity, and apparently the highest level of brain activity that's ever been measured is jazz pianists while they're improvising. Now, I know that's true because it was told me by a rock guitarist. So it's the hostile witness principle. Okay, so anyway, let's go forwards. Okay, look at this quote. Cornell University geneticist Dr. John Sanford said, random mutation and natural selection have a collective IQ of 0. That's interesting, isn't it? If you think about it, it's true. So any type of aesthetic appreciation for music, art, literature, or poetry, if we go with the materialist evolutionist viewpoint, must be just a random byproduct of the evolution of essential survival skills. Right? That's the only reason we would have it. It would never be retained if it was sort of fluff or something that's unnecessary. Now, anybody here follows cycling? No? Okay. There's a brilliant... last Olympics, the English cycling team beat us in the gold medal. So... Now, the reason I'm talking about that is because one of the people who was very much involved in the design of the bicycle that beat us is a man by the name of Stuart Burgess. Now, he's a really brilliant designer, and he also happens to be a creation scientist. So, this shows that perhaps not all creation scientists are dumb evangelicals who don't know what they're talking about, right? So, which is sometimes what you hear. He's a professor of design at Bristol University, and he's written extensively about creation in a book of his called The Design and Origin of Man. So I'm just going to share a little quote. Okay, according to evolution, human intelligence evolved for survival tasks such as hunting and tool making. However, it's very obvious that the human intelligence is vastly greater than what is required for basic survival. In contrast, the supreme abilities of the human brain are just what would be expected from a creator who made humans to be spiritual beings capable of intellectual activities such as rational thought and creativity. So let's have a look at what the Bible actually says about creativity in music. This is going to be interesting because you might not hear this story very often. Oh, there we go, backwards again. That's my lovely wife and me. So, taken a few weeks ago on our anniversary. Adam and Eve, I don't think Adam was wearing a tux. It says, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, created to him, male and female, created to them. So, we are created, according to the Bible, in God's image, right? So the first act, the first verb in the Bible, just the fifth word in the English Bible is created, right? So it makes sense that if God is creative, then he would imbue us with creativity, right? Out of the ground, the Lord formed every beast of the field. So this is, according to the Bible, right when Adam was created. He brought them to Adam to see what he would call them. And I love that phrase, to see what he would call them. He didn't tell him what to call them. He didn't order him. He wanted to see what Adam would call them. He gave him the linguistic creative gifts and let Adam exercise them. I think that's really fascinating. And whatever Adam called every living creature, that was its name. And Adam's next recorded act on meeting Eve for the first time was the world's first love poem. Adam said, "This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man." So, but the origins of music go back even further. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if you have understanding. When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Right? So this is music happening while the earth is getting created. Singing happening. I think that's amazing. There was music at the creation of everything. Now, what about the origin of humans doing music? Well, as the Bible says that too, Genesis chapter 4, which is 8 generations after Adam. Ada bare Jabal, he was the father of such as dwell in tents and such as have cattle. He invented country music. And his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all such as handle the harp and organ. He invented orchestral music. But I think actually that was a bit silly, but I think what's actually really interesting is that even in the modern orchestra today, almost all the instruments are either wind instruments or stringed instruments. Almost everything is either wind or string. So right here we have those broad two categories. The only thing missing is percussion, which gets a good workout in the Psalms. So in the Bible, music was used for many important occasions. I'm just going to go through these fairly quickly. Moses sang a song after the Egyptians were covered by the sea. They sang a song to a well to make the water come up, which is really interesting. David was a great musician, King David. We still read his psalms today, and I think it's pretty amazing that the words written 3,000 years ago are still read and sung every single day today. One historian actually said that no other poetry has been set to music more often than the Psalms in all of Western civilization, which is fascinating when you think it was written 3,000 years ago by a sheep herder. So this one says that Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him. So music has a spiritual effect. It can lift you up. It can take away your demons, right? Elijah also had a similar experience. He called for a minstrel, and while the minstrel was praying, that the hand of the Lord came upon him. He actually received God's voice speaking to him because of the music that the minstrel was playing. David, 4,000. Imagine that, an orchestra of 4,000. That is incredible. 4,000 praise the Lord. Can you imagine an orchestra of 4,000? Has anyone seen an orchestra of 4,000? But that's what David had. He was an amazing, not only a warrior, but a poet and a singer and musician. And his son Solomon wrote 1,005 songs. Incredible. So David was one of a really important figure in the history of music, I'd say, because he actually brought the music of liturgy into worship in a very big way. Okay, another thing in the Bible, the singers had to go out in front of the army, the musicians had to go out in front of the army. I'm glad I didn't have that gig, but they did it and they survived. And this is one of my favourite verses in the entire Bible. So, we certify you that as touching, it shall not be lawful to oppose tribute, custom or toll on any other, the singers, the musicians. So, musicians should not have to pay tax. I've written to the ATO about this. They still haven't replied, but anyway. Jesus sang a hymn with his disciples before they went into the Mount of Olives. Very, very important moment in his life. Bible instructs us to sing in hymns and spiritual songs, make melody in our hearts towards the Lord. And music at the end of creation as well as the beginning, and not only 4,000 now, but 144,000 singing and playing in heaven. So there is music woven throughout the Bible, and this is just a very small sample. So in a biblical worldview, music is really important. It's a way of expressing our joy, a way of communicating with God, a way of lifting our spirits, a way of winning battles, a way of defeating the tax office. And so now I'm going to play a piece of mine. Oh, no. Wait on that. Okay. I'll go back to the one before. Thanks. So I'm going to play a piece. This is all from my new album that I'm going to release tomorrow. This one's called Your Majesty. So it's all about the majesty of creation. And this was actually written when I was in the country of Jordan. And I was walking through some of the most magnificent scenery in what's called Wadi Rum. I don't know if you've ever heard of the 7 Pillars of Wisdom, where our Lawrence of Arabia went. And just the scenery there is absolutely stunning. So I wrote this piece when I was there. science. All right? So, who knows what the harmonic series is? Oh, a few of us do. Well, I want to show you, for those who don't, I want to show you, this is one of this is where the scientific basis of music comes in. Okay? Don't worry, I'm not going to play country music. Okay, I'll try. Okay, here we go. Now here is a low C, basically. Okay. Now, if I take a point halfway along the string, exactly halfway, I get that note. The reason it sounds similar is because it's vibrating at exactly half the speed. Okay? So I've got this C and this C. Right? This is... Now, if I divide the string into thirds, and you're going to have to trust me on this. Hear that note? So I've got, this one's divided into thirds, and I can get the other one up there. There you go. It's a G. If I divide into quarters, get that note. Right? Now I can divide the string into fifths. Got another one. I can divide the string into sixths. Get that one. And then sevenths. Eighths. It's a bit harder to do up here. There it is. The ninth. And so on and so forth. So what we get this chord. Right? That's the first notes of it. Now I'm going to show you a little something. This won't work on a digital piano because it lacks what's called sympathetic vibrations. But I'll show you this demonstration I did on a real piano, and you'll see what I did. I held down these notes, and I just played a low note, and you'll see what happens. You'll hear what happens, hopefully. Okay, hopefully. So basically what happens is, when I play the low note there, listen. Get that chord ringing. Okay. Now, I'm going to play another note. I'm going to play hold down the black notes, and I'm going to play the same low note. Let's see what happens. Almost nothing. Interesting, huh? So why is that? It's because of what's called sympathetic resonance. It means the low notes the high notes are vibrating in sympathy with the low notes. And the low note's called the fundamental, and the high note's called the overtone. So yeah, I'm a fundamentalist, or whatever. And my music has religious overtones. But anyway, so basically what this does is it gives us this beautiful chord. Right? This chord feels so warm and affirming, doesn't it? It's because there's this agreement between the low notes and the higher notes. What if I change one of the high notes? Right? Now there's tension in that chord. Especially when I press the wrong button. It's tension. See that tension there? The minor chord is, there's a conflict between the fundamental and what's happening up here. Now, I could even get really worse and I go, ooh. So these notes don't agree at all. So I compose movie music, so I use this. I use it to manipulate the viewers. If I want them to feel warm and fuzzy, or something heroic is happening, I'll use these chords. These big, strong chords. Ah, yes, the hero is coming. If I want to make them feel scared, I'll go. Something bad's about to happen, right? So we use this science to create emotion. I think it's fascinating. So I can go to also very distant chords that aren't related. So you get something like this. An effect like this.
At the far reaches of the universe.
You can imagine something happening something like that. So there's this, or if you've got these nice warm fuzzy chords, you've got this feeling of being home. And it's all very scientific. You know? Sometimes I've done tertiary courses in music and they're all just relative and cultural. But actually no, I'd say it's actually scientific. Right? And harmony can do amazing things to music. So listen to this. Let's say I wrote a tune that goes like this. Pretty cool tune, huh? What do you think? Really brilliant? Really, really world-changing. Probably going to be one of the most famous pieces of music ever written. Right? No? Okay. Let's see what a master can do with it. But there it is. All it is. So, this is the wonder of harmony. And another thing about harmony is that there's this dissonance. These notes that go together, they're called consonances. The notes that don't go together, they're called dissonance. Right? Now, in classical music, there's dissonance everywhere. Bach always had dissonances in his music. But they would always resolve. Right? There would be this resolution of the dissonance. So you can have the dissonance, but there'd always be a resolution. Right? I think there's a very important worldview thing happening here. I think, my personal opinion is this: bad stuff happens. Dissonances happen in life, but it's going to work out. It's going to be okay. God's in control. Right? So, when you get to the 20th century, dissonance just stays there. Not resolved, not taken care of. It's the worldview thing. I'll talk about that more in a minute. So, there's this beautiful system of tonality that developed over the time, and I think a lot of it actually did come from the music of Christian worship. Harmony is only about 1,000 years old as far as we know. So there's this beautiful system of 12 keys. Each key has 7-note scales, and each scale has a 3-note chord. Listen to those numbers, 12, 7, 3. Very important numbers in the Bible. If you know your book of Revelation, there's 7s, 12s, and 3s everywhere. So I wonder about that. I wonder if it's something they did on purpose or whether it was something, I don't know. But there's that wonderful system. The idea of the Trinity is expressed really well by a 3-note chord. 3 parts, but they all make up this wonderful chord. They each have their own individual in identity, but together they make a beautiful chord. It's like the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, the doctrine of the Trinity. It's a lovely illustration of it. So J.S. Bach was one of the first composers to ever write music in all 12 keys. And he said, all music should have no other end and aim than the glory of God and the recreation of the soul. Where this is not kept in mind, there is no true music, but only an infernal clamour and ranting. I wonder what you'd think of the hip-hop top charts today. I found a list of the 100 greatest choral works of all time. Just somebody's opinion on the web, but it was interesting that 95 out of 100 of them were overtly Christian religious works. So I wonder why that is. Maybe we could think about that. Franz Joseph Haydn was another very godly composer. Oh, going backwards again. This is a actual wood cutting of a performance of Haydn, one of Haydn's works. I think you can see him somewhere there, being shown to his seat. So this was the last performance of the great oratorio called The Creation in March the 27th, 1808. And Haydn was apparently carried into the hall on a chair. And there's this wonderful moment in the creation when the light comes, that there be light, and this enormous outburst of orchestral colour happens. And Haydn, and everyone just stood up and applauded and clapped. And Haydn, in a typical gesture, weakly pointed upwards and said, "Not from me, everything comes from up there." So, soli Deo Gloria. But an enormous change came over Europe in the 19th century, as maybe the students of history will know. And composers such as Wagner came along who did not share the faith of their predecessors. Interestingly enough, Richard Wagner wrote the first piece of music that can be defined as not being in any particular key. It was the Tristan and Isolde. And it uses a lot of this chord. Notice something about that chord which is really interesting for the musicians. It doesn't have a perfect fifth in it. It doesn't have this solid basis. You don't really know where you are, right? So one musicologist said that it creates a feeling of constant uncertainty, no ultimate truth. In musical terms, it's similar to materialistic evolution. There's no real purpose or goal in it, just a restless wandering from chord to chord. And the opera ends tragically with the death of the main protagonist. Now, Wagner wrote some incredibly great music, there's no question about that. But it's interesting, the worldview changed. No longer the resolution to the tonic, no longer the coming back to the center, no longer coming back to God, but a restless wandering, which we don't know where it'll end. Here's a lovely quote from a Czech avant-garde composer. Anybody know Erwin Schulhoff? Anybody heard of Erwin Schulhoff? No. Even Andy's studied music, he doesn't. So look at the language in this quote. This is from about 1919. Absolute art is revolution. It leads to overthrow in order to open new paths and is the most powerful in music. The idea of revolution in art has evolved for decades under whatever sun the creators live. Right? So the last thing. The complete escape from imperialistic tonality and rhythm. Imperialistic tonality. So in the mind of this avant-garde composer, playing tonal chords was imperialism. It's very sad. And that climbed to an ecstatic change for the better. Unfortunately, he was a communist, this young man. And if he'd known what Stalin did about 10 years later, he would have probably thought twice about calling it an ecstatic change for the better. So the whole 20th century of music was really dominated by a lot of that very dissonant music. So when I was studying in the middle, right at the end, in the 80s, I was studying music at the Conservatorium of Music, and this kind of atonal music was really strong. It was really pushed upon us, like abandon all tonality, abandon playing in a key. You need to play, this weird atonal stuff, right? So this is another very important moment in my life. I went to my composition teacher and I asked him, why could Bach write such beautiful harmonic music, while today the classical composers were writing ugly, unharmonic and unmelodic music? And I've never forgotten his reply. He said, well, I suppose they had God in those days, but we don't have God anymore. Interesting, isn't it? So the worldview was reflected in the music. So he's actually one of Australia's most famous contemporary composers right now. Now, so I've been talking about Bach, so now I'm going to do a little demonstration of a piece by Bach, but I need a piano teacher. Andy, you'll do. What I want you to do is come up. So I'm going to play Bach's Prelude No. 1. Now Bach wrote this wonderful piece of music called the Well-Tempered Clavier, and it's all about music in all 12 different keys. He's one of the first composers to do that. Groundbreaking stuff. It absolutely set up Western music for the next 200 years. And so this prelude is the Prelude No. 1. It's quite an easy prelude to play, but I'm going to make it more fun, and I'm going to transpose it for you. Okay? So Andy, you're going to toss the coin. If it's heads, I'll go up. If it's tails, I go down. Then you're going to roll the dice, and the dice is going to tell me how many semitones to go, okay?
Okay.
And Andy's also going to stand here to make sure I don't use the transpose button.
So, what was it?
Heads or tails?
Okay, heads.
So I'm going up.
Yep.
And roll the dice. Five.
Semitones.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. F major. Okay, so here we go. So I've got a rhetorical question for you. Why did I evolve the ability to transpose Bach into 12 different keys? What's the selection advantage for that? Okay? Just for fun. Let's have a look at this. Never failed to want to give up playing piano after I watched Oscar Peterson. So, Oscar Peterson, my wife actually asked me, how did Oscar Peterson remember all those notes? Well, the answer is he was improvising. He was making that all up as he went along, okay? And but I want to bring up something about these two pianists. Both of these two pianists are from Canada. Angela Hewitt is Canadian, she's from a European descent. Oscar Peterson was the son of immigrants from Trinidad, right? So his ancestors, Oscar's ancestors a few generations back, would most probably have been slaves imported from Africa on a Trinidadian plantation. I believe they were liberated in about 1835, right? But a few generations later, Oscar became one of the greatest jazz pianists in the world, absolutely But the opinion of many scientists in the late 19th and early 20th century was that Negroes were less evolved species than Caucasians. So here's a sample quote from a scientist from that period. At some future point, not distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, the anthropomorphous, meaning apes that are similar to humans, apes will no doubt be exterminated. The break will then be rendered wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, as we may hope, than the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of at present between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. Anybody know who said that? We have a capital city of the most populous state of Indigenous Australians named after him. So, this was actually his belief too. This is just one quote, but it's been studied. So, something to think about, right? Are we descended from apes, or are we made in the image of God? It's a very deep, it's a very important question, right? And if we are descended from apes, how did we come up with music, right? So Darwin actually thought that it was to attract members of the opposite sex, and that's how it became retained in our gene pool. Okay. Now I've done a little bit of my own empirical research onto this, and let me put this in context. I went to an all-boys secondary school, the Canberra Grammar School, and eventually around year 9 or 10, some of the more observant of us boys realised that there was this different sort of subspecies that had long hair and wore dresses. And we found out that they were called girls. Interesting. It took us a while, but we figured it all out. As part of a strategy to attract the interest of these curious creatures, a few of us decided to form a rock band. Since I played the piano, I got to be the keyboard player. It didn't take me long for me to realise that the female of the species were interested in the lead singer, second, the lead guitarist, third, maybe the bass player, fourth, maybe the drummer. The keyboard player was not on the list. I remember a particularly painful moment at one gig. During the set break, I struck up a conversation with one of the female of the species and asked her how she liked the music. "Oh, the band is great," she said. "Yeah, I'm playing in the band." I said, "Really?" She said, "What instrument?" I said, "Keyboards." She said, "There was a keyboard?" Oh, anyway, so that proves it doesn't work. There was a famous Harvard psychology professor called Steven Pinker who called music auditory cheesecake. For him, music is a useless byproduct of natural selection, a potentially wasteful use of our brain's resources that brings pleasure but serves no evolutionary purpose for the species. There you go. Thank you, Steven Pinker. So some of the very, very big important differences between us and apes that enable us to play music are the anatomy of the hands and the nature of the cerebral cortex. So this is the hardware and the software, okay? So this is something Stuart Burgess said. So all the different things that human hands can do that primates can't do. One of them is we have this great thumb, so I can do a scale. Right? Apes can't do that. Try it. So we've got all these unique things in our hands that the way we can flex, move our hands, right? The opposable thumb, which I just demonstrated. The motor cortex. Now, a quarter of the human motor cortex is dedicated to controlling the hands. A quarter. That's enormous. That's our part of our brains. Apes do not have a large section of the motor cortex controlling the hands, right? So, there's a very big difference in the size of the cerebral cortex of apes and humans, right? Now, so this is an interesting piece of scientific research from peer-reviewed scientific journal. In the cortex, 17.4% of the connections are specific to humans. That means 17.4% of our brains are completely different from apes, right? The human brain has around 100 billion neurons, right? Typically about 1,000 connections per neuron. A neuron is basically a brain cell. This means the total number of connections in the brain is the order of 100 trillion. That is a lot of connections that are happening in our brain, right? So if you put those two numbers together, I'll just do this really quickly. 17.4% of 100 trillion is 17.4 trillion. According to evolutionary theory, all of those connections had to evolve by random mutation, all guesswork, no foresight, and it all had to happen in 7 million years. Now, let's say modern apes have evolved at the same rate as humans, so they're as different from our ancestors. Let's give them that benefit of the doubt. So only 8.7 trillion different new connections. By 7 million, that means 1.25 million per year. New connections have to evolve in our brains, right? Now, the generations of primates are approximately 10 years. So that means for every generation, there would have to be 12.5 million new connections evolve in the brain by completely random mutation and natural selection. Now, is that realistic? Is that realistic? That's the question. Is it realistic? And remember also this, not only the software, but also the hardware, that's the agility of the hands, would have to evolve by chance too. So not only one characteristic, but both characteristics would also have to evolve. So the odds of such a scenario, I would say, are quite fantastically small, right? And to cap it off, even if that could all happen, scientific observations have shown there is an area of the brain containing many millions of brain cells dedicated to the appreciation of beauty. Evolution can't explain why humans have such a profound appreciation of beauty. According to evolutionary theory, the ability to appreciate beauty would be explicable by nothing more than a combination of genetic accidents that somehow gave a survival advantage. To put the problem another way, evolution cannot explain why ape men who cannot appreciate beauty became extinct. Interesting, isn't it? Something to think about. I'm going to play a piece now called Wings of the Morning. This is off my CD. So, my new CD, which is called Wings of the Morning. So this is one of those 3,000-year-old poems that I talked about before. It's a quote from one of my favourites, Psalm 139. I take the wings of the morning, dwell in the outermost parts of the sea. Even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. I probably better stop here. I've got a few more pages, but it's all right. It's time for a cuppa, I think. But basically, I think my main thing that drives me in my worldview is hope. In my music, what have we got? There's hope that creation will be restored, and it's in a mess right now. We know that. It's the amazing paradox, the beautiful design we see, the incredible design of our brains, the incredible design in nature, the design of our hands, all that we see. But still, there's death and there's suffering. And this is the paradox that we see. But it is explained in the Christian faith. It's because of our first parents' rebellion against God that brought the curse upon us. But the good news is that everything will be restored. And this is through the ministry of Jesus. So, for some reason, God put the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Is Jason here? Oh, there he is. So I don't know why he put it in the garden, but Jason does. So afterwards you can go and ask Jason about that. God himself shall be with them and be their God, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. There shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. It's going to be a good day. So that's my hope. That's what gives my music hope, that promise. And it's a hope that we can all partake of, I believe, in this world that's less than perfect. It's a beautiful world, but definitely less than perfect. Thank you. Thanks for listening.